Hi everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 27th, where we are putting some closure onto Midsummer Night's Dream. Wanted to talk a little bit about language, and I hope at this point you have finished reading A Midsummer Night's Dream, even though we saw production. As you know, production is never a substitute for actually reading, and that you are in the midst of Much Ado About Nothing. But as you know, we will have several classes devoted to Much Ado About Nothing, much like we did with A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in terms of A Midsummer Night's Dream, you can see in the notes below that I wanted to talk about iambic pentameter, which is something that we also talked about with the sonnets, that Shakespeare will often write in a 10-syllable line. We know that that's required for the sonnets, not necessarily required for drama, but oftentimes we will see that. And if nothing else, this sense of when Shakespeare decides to use verse and prose is going to be important to us understanding the plays. And verse is poetry, and prose are complete sentences, much like we ourselves would write. And when you think about the kind of writing that you do, that would be the kind of writing that you would submit a journal in, probably, which, by the way, is going to be due for Midsummer Night's Dream at the ending of today, if you are watching this video on the 27th, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, much like you did with the sonnet journal, and then I will get that back to you. Now, the idea behind verse or poetry is that this is supposed to be a higher form of language. So oftentimes you see the higher level characters speaking in verse, but Shakespeare will oftentimes make political commentary about higher level characters experiencing descent by having them descend into prose, complete sentences. And Shakespeare will oftentimes make the opposite observation. Lower level characters who are supposed to be speaking in prose or complete sentences will oftentimes shift into verse or poetry to show how they can ascend in the chain of being, which we had talked about was a way of ranking everything in Renaissance society. One was born to a particular position, but one of the things that Shakespeare's plays oftentimes highlights is that despite one's birthright, that doesn't necessarily mean that one is immune to folly, and that also doesn't mean that one is not capable of achieving insight. And that said, I think that A Midsummer Night's Dream is a subversive play in the sense that everyone is criticized when it comes to love. That despite one's age, despite one's status, despite one's stage of relationship, ultimately everyone is subject to the follies associated with love. And certainly we'll know that Shakespeare will utilize a good amount of symbolism in his writing, which is something that we will find in not only this play, but in the plays that follow. But I wanted to highlight some of the quotes that struck me as important. The good news about Shakespeare is that his plays are divided into act and scene and line, so that we don't necessarily have to rely on page number the way we do when we are traditionally quoting. So you'll see in the notes below that I've indicated where you can find these quotes based on act and then scene and line, which is how you yourselves would be quoting when we finally get to writing a formal academic paper. That said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the paper next class. That won't be due for a little while, not until Much Ado About Nothing is finished. But I wanted to at least prepare you for some of the conventions associated with writing. And I assume that you've probably covered this in previous English classes, but I don't want to assume too much. And I also wanted to give you some suggested paper topics as well. Those are merely suggestions because ultimately you could create your own paper topic. And as you will find as I go through it next class, that I'm merely providing you with topics, not with a specific thesis. That's the position that you would be taking, the specific position in your paper that you would be defending, both through paraphrase, your own language, but also quotation, specific language from the text. part of the exercise in writing a paper is discovering the thesis, the point that you want to make. And in fact, many times writers begin without necessarily knowing what their thesis is going to be. That's something that they discover in the process of writing. And then what they can do once they've discovered what their thesis is, then the convention is that the thesis is usually in the first paragraph. So you can actually write backwards. You can write the first paragraph last if you so wanted to, but just make sure that it's the first paragraph, which basically is telling the reader what it is you're going to be talking about, which you may not know until you actually begin your investigation. But at any rate, going back to some of the quotations that I wanted to highlight, and these are in no way the only quotes that we could focus on. This is a very witty play. It perhaps is not as witty as Much Ado About Nothing. Benedict and Beatrice have some wonderful exchanges of wit. In fact, we could say they have a merry war of wit. I use that term deliberately because in Much Ado About Nothing, the major characters are returning back from war, but might I suggest that they're entering into another battle, and that's the battle associated with love. But at any rate, one of my favorite lines is when Lysander says in Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 to 94, and he's speaking to Aegeus. And Lysander says this is where Lysander says to Demetrius, you have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermias. And then, of course, we learn a little bit about the prior history of the characters in Act 1, Scene 1, line 107, when Lysander says that Demetrius has made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. Made love is not necessarily sexual consummation. It's the idea that he's wooed her. So this is our clue that they had a relationship prior to the play. One of the morals of the play, I think, can be found very nicely in Act 1, Scene 1, line 134, that the course of true love never did run smooth. So if you've heard that line before, now you know it's from A Midsummer Night's Dream. One of the things Shakespeare likes to do is to show examples of good rhyme and also examples of poor rhyme, particularly in the character of Bottom, in a way that allows Shakespeare to critique and mock his contemporaries, his competition. And the idea behind Act 5, or one of the ideas behind Act 5, is that this is an opportunity for us to see what one of Shakespeare's contemporaries might have written. And obviously, Pyramus and Thisbe is in nowhere at the same level of the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that's done deliberately for Shakespeare to show us his, well, for lack of a better word, genius. But just to give you a very brief example of good rhyme, this is in Act 1, Scene 1, line 202 to 207. This is Hermia speaking. One of the reasons why it's good rhyme is because it's natural rhyme that also helps to forward the plot. And Hermia says, "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh then, what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell." If you want an example of bad rhyme that occurs shortly thereafter, Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 to 38. This is where Bottom is rehearsing, and his speech, "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates." Notice the sing-song quality to it. Ba, 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 ba. It's almost like roses are red and violets are blue and sugar is sweet and so are you. It has rhyme, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has greatness. And in fact, it's utter nonsense what he's muttering. Even worse, his commentary afterwards, that was lofty. So he basically is complimenting himself, which goes to show what a bottom or what an idiot he is, which is why it's so wonderful that Puck decides to turn him into an ass, a bottom, because that's his basically character trait. Little piece of trivia, I can't remember if I mentioned this last class or not, but the donkey or the ass was considered to be the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. The audience would know this, so this is a great possibility for sexual humor and bawdiness later on when Bottom and Titania basically form a couple. But first, let me get to Act 2. And one of the things that I had mentioned last class is that one of the major themes is about power dynamics and who has it and who doesn't in love relationships. And when Titania, Queen Titania, the queen of the fairies, dares to defy her husband and basically say that not only will she not give up the changeling boy, which I oftentimes think of as a remote control when a modern day couple is basically arguing over control. It's less about the television remote control and it's more about who has power and who doesn't. It's probably less about the changeling boy and more about the fact of the idea that Titania would dare to defy her husband. But she takes it a step further and says in Act 2, Scene 1, line 63, I've forsworn his bed and company, which is pretty huge that she's denying sexual relations. It's one of the reasons why Oberon is so angry with her and wants revenge. Now, one of the things that Shakespeare will sometimes do is put in dialogue for us as audience so that we can understand what's going on. Keep in mind that the special effects that we've become accustomed to in contemporary times don't necessarily exist during Shakespeare's time. So a very small point, but this would be in Act 2, Scene 1, line 186, when Oberon says, I am invisible. That's for us as audience to understand that as a fairy, he's invisible. Therefore, when the other characters are on stage, they act as if they can't see him because they're not supposed to see him. It's been thought that at the time of the Renaissance, there might have been a specific costume that would denote invisibility, so that would also cue in the audience. But this explains why Oberon is able to be on stage and none of the characters notice him or interact with him. The same with Puck. The fairies can become invisible. Now, one of the things about this play is that it tends to be dark. And in fact, Much Ado About Nothing will be even darker, which we'll talk about. And this play is filled with threats, including Demetrius in Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 to 237. Keep in mind at this point, Helena is following Demetrius into the woods. He does not want to be pursued because he wants to be able to get Hermia. And Demetrius tells Helena, if thou follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the woods. What that means is that he's threatening to take her virginity. Again, keep in mind the importance of virginity for female during this time period, that a female without virginity prior to marriage would be seen as damaged goods. And I can't remember if I told you this story or not, but it was as recently as the 1980s when actually Prince Charles was marrying at that point, Lady Diana, who became Princess Diana. She actually had to visit the royal gynecologist who examined her hymen to determine that she was still a virgin. And I know very well, if you know biology, that the hymen is not a way that one can determine virginity. But nevertheless, she needed to undergo that procedure to, quote, prove, unquote, her virginal status. Things have changed, obviously, since then. Since their children, Prince William, and what ended up becoming Prince Charles's daughter-in-law, Kate, they lived together when they were in college and after college. They didn't have to undergo that kind of scrutiny. But in terms of time, 1980s really wasn't that long ago in the overall scheme of things. So this idea here that Demetrius is threatening to take Helena's most precious virtue. And I always find this to be so interesting that Shakespeare sets this play in one of the most sexually charged pagan holidays possible. So there's always that undercurrent of eroticism, even though on the surface there is also this requirement for virginity. One of the things that Helena says that's quite telling in Act 2, Scene 1, line 240 to 242 is that your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed and we're not made to woo. Helena's a tricky character. Certainly, if we were to read her from contemporary standards, she's quite passive. And in fact, one might even call her a stalker. She seems that she's quite submissive and is willing to embarrass and humiliate herself, all for the sake of love and unrequited love. And I can't disagree with any of that. But the statement that she makes here, that she has decided to take the role of pursuer, to do something active, in a time period when women were not allowed to be pursuer, does complicate the issue. I think if you remember the very beginning of the semester on the syllabus, I had left you with a series of quotes, and one of them was, "Don't expect any simple answers from Shakespeare. Shakespeare will be filled with all of the contradictions and complexities of real life." And I think Helena and this statement is a good instance of showing a certain level of strength, but also we see a great amount of weakness. Now, Hermia at one point makes it very clear that she still has her virginity. Again, that would be necessary for the happy ending in this play. In Act 2, Scene 2, line 57, this is when Hermia and Lysander have run away into the forest. Lysander wants to lie next to her. Her response is, "For love and courtesy, lie further off in humane modesty." In other words, she wants to retain her modesty. She's afraid if they're too close together physically, they might be tempted by the moment and she would lose her virginity. So when we get to Act 3, I had suggested that you could think of Shakespeare's plays as a kind of pyramid, and Act 3 would be the pinnacle or the point of that pyramid. This is where the conflict will come to a head. Bottom, of all people, the character who is an ass, makes one of the most insightful statements, unbeknownst to him, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 to 144, that reason and love keep little company nowadays. And I think that's quite true, that in love, one sacrifices one's reason. Definitely, we've seen that throughout A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we'll also see it in Much Ado About Nothing. Puck also says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 115, "What fools these mortals be." And that is another theme, I would say, is that mortals, but in this case, even the fairy kingdom, are fools when it comes to love. I talked a little bit about the two former best friends who were closer than sisters, Helena and Hermia, almost coming to blows in Act 3 over love relationships, illustrating how friendships can be strained or even destroyed because of love. And one of the great insults is when Helena says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 288, remember Helena is tall and blonde, and she calls Hermia, who is short and brunette, "You puppet." Of course, a puppet is small, and of course, a puppet is controlled by someone else. So this would be an insult to her former best friend. The insults continue because at this point, Hermia responds in Act 3, Scene 2, line 296, calling her friend Helena, the tall blonde one, "You painted maypole." Again, painted meaning false beauty through cosmetics. And oftentimes that was associated with being a strumpet or whore. And maypole, not only is that tall and thin, but it also was and is a phallic symbol in the May Day celebrations of fertility. So she basically has just called her former best friend a strumpet, and she's also called her a phallus. Now, this play illustrates how fine that line is, if you've ever heard of the cliche, between love and hate. Remember, at the play's beginning, Demetrius and Lysander are completely in love with Hermia, the short brunette. Now, granted, their feelings change because of manipulation through love juice. But that said, look at some of the language that occurs in Act 3. Act 3, Scene 2, line 258, where basically Hermia is told, "Away, you Ethiop." Ethiop is supposed to be a reference to Ethiopia. Again, not necessarily dark skin, but definitely dark hair and dark eyes. And Lysander continues on and says, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 268 to 269, "Should I hurt her? strike her, kill her dead. So his first go-to position, now that he hates Hermia, is to kill her. And then he says, no, I guess I won't do that. And then Lysander continues in Act 3, Scene 2, line 327 to 329. It's saying to Hermia, get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bead, you acorn. All of these are insults about Hermia's height, about being small, a dwarf, a minimus, a bead, and an acorn. So if we were watching a tragedy, tragic things would have occurred, but we're watching a comedy, so there has to be a resolution. So ultimately, the love juice is going to need to be removed from the wrong party. In this instance, that would be Lysander. It'll remain on Demetrius's eyes so that he remains in love with Helena. But Lysander will return to loving Hermia. And again, perhaps we have to be a bit generous with our suspension of disbelief in that all of the characters are going to have a happily ever after. And in particular, the female characters are willing to forgive the male characters. And I think I mentioned this in a previous class. I had a professor in college who both said that, or who said that both Lysander and Demetrius are jerks. It's just a question of which one is the bigger jerk. I think there's truth to that. But in Act 4, we do get the resolution, and that means that ultimately Theseus, who has to make a decision, is going to cut his losses and decide that since the two young couples, Hermia and Lysander, and Demetrius and Helena, are content with one another, he's going to allow that union to remain. So it's Aegeus, the father, Hermia's father, whose will is overborne. And that, I think, is somewhat of a progressive commentary that it's the daughter who gets her way, not the father, despite gender and age differences. But of course, don't expect easy answers here, because Titania, unfortunately, the queen of the fairies, not only loses the changeling boy, but she also is humiliated by falling in love with Bottom the ass. In the performance that I had us watch from the Globe Theater, it's pretty obvious that Queen Titania and Bottom, the donkey ass, consummate their relationship. Again, keep in mind what I said earlier, that the donkey is thought to be the most well-endowed creature of the animal kingdom. And then when Theseus removes the spell, Titania is quite willing to forgive Theseus. Again, perhaps we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here. One of the best morals, perhaps, of this play is in Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, when Bottom says, man is but an ass. Of course, this is funny because he's a figurative and was a literal ass, but we see how everyone has acted like an ass over the course of this play. And a scene that might seem to be completely unimportant, but this goes to show Shakespeare's attention to the political realities of his world. Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 to 100. And basically, we've got King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta settling in to watch the play within a play. They're speaking to one another. And at one point, Theseus says, where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale, and in conclusion dumbly have broken off. Yet I've picked a welcome. This is viewed as a tribute to the queen, that the queen who would have been in the audience watching these plays, and yes, play watching and play acting was considered to be somewhat lowbrow and unsavory, but who's going to question the queen? Fortunately for us, she was a supporter of the arts, which is why these plays still exist. And there are plenty of reasons for her to be upset or to have been offended by what she just saw, whether it be the commentary about love or whether it be some of the ways that gender was portrayed. If for whatever reason she was offended, this idea of her sitting in the audience and hearing Theseus and Hippolyta talk about what generous and astute leaders they are, that they understand that when their subjects don't necessarily greet them properly, it's not from a lack of respect. In fact, it's from too much respect, that they're too nervous in order to give a graceful greeting. That Queen Elizabeth would have been in the audience and thinking to herself, that's exactly the way I am as a ruler. And then when we get to Act 5, which seems to be almost tacked on, but it's not, It's an opportunity for us to watch the play within a play, which I always liken to an elementary school performance, where literally everything has to be literally explained. And again, that gives very little credit to the audience. So Shakespeare is not only critiquing his competition, but he's also critiquing the audience members who go to see his competition. We see that this is a very amateurish production where lines are misremembered and there are errors. It's poorly acted, poorly written, poorly played, and just poor in general. It allows for great humor for when the other characters in the play are watching. They obviously are having a delightful time at laughing at what's supposed to be a serious production. Pyramus and Thisbe is very similar to a play that probably is one of Shakespeare's most well-known, Romeo and Juliet, about the tragedy that can occur within love. And again, this play could have been a tragic play if things had been different. But they never stop, any of these characters, to reflect upon the point that they themselves had been equally idiotic in love. And this wasn't a play. This was their, quote, real life, unquote. And this is very important for us as audience, because if we're enjoying Act 5 and mocking it, and we don't stop to think about the way that we ourselves have been, well, for lack of a better word, asses in love, then we've completely missed the point of the play. Again, lots here to be offended about if you are watching this play, which is one of the reasons why Act 5 gives us Puck's final speech, which is an attempt by Puck to try to kind of smooth some ruffled feathers and to offer an apology, but in typical Puck fashion, it's backhanded. But when Hippolytus says in Act 5, Scene 1, line 210, "This is the silliest stuff I ever heard." Again, if we think that about A Midsummer Night's Dream, we just don't get it. That we've acted out the silliest stuff that could ever be when it's come to love. Because we're blind when it comes to love. Because we have no control over love. Because love is like a dream. And it oftentimes can turn into a nightmare. That we lose the ability to reason. That we could fall in love with an ass and not even see that. And many more statements about love. But don't think that Shakespeare will miss the opportunity to make a bawdy statement. And as I had indicated, and we saw in the sonnets as well, that this was not necessarily a conservative time in terms of sex. It was definitely a conservative time in terms of politics, but not necessarily sexuality or violence, as we will see when we get to the great tragedies. But this is in Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. And this is in the conversation with basically the Pyramus and Thisbe play. And the line seems innocent until you've actually read it. So Thisbe and Pyramus are speaking to one another. Again, this is in Act 5, Scene 1, line 423. And Thisbe says, "O wall, full often hast thou heard my moans, for parting my fair Pyramus and me. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." In my version, up in thee happens to be in square brackets, which means that this is the editor's best guess as to what the language would be based on the rhyme, based on the meter, based on the content. Remember, we had talked about that sometimes there are areas of disagreement with Shakespeare's plays. We have editors who put together all of the quartos, or those paperback versions, that unauthorized versions that existed of a play, and compare it against the folio, that quote definitive unquote version that was put together 7 years after Shakespeare's death from his contemporaries. And some plays have more questions than others. They're known as the problem plays. But even the plays that aren't the problem plays, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, there are occasions when an editor may have to insert their own language or guess as to the meaning of a word. So you might see that in the footnotes with a question mark. And that means that's the editor's best guess as to what that word would mean in that context during that time period. But again, to go back to this statement, O wall, full often hast thou heard my moans, being sexual moans. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones, stones being testicles, cherry lips being in reference to oral sex. Thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee, lime and hair being pubic hair. Remember the first time I heard this in college, I was quite stunned. So I don't take credit nor blame for this interpretation, but leave it to Shakespeare to give a wink and a nod. And of course, he could easily deny if someone thought that he had gone too far. And then we end up with Puck. Puck is such an interesting character because he, in many ways, controls and manipulates the action. In fact, he's been compared to a kind of Shakespeare character. It's interesting because Puck is supposed to be a servant. Yet, without Puck, I wonder if any of this could have occurred. It almost reminds me of corporate America, where the CEO is supposed to be in charge, but it's really the administrative assistant that does all of the work. That said, I was just an aside. We have Puck at the very ending say in his very famous speech. So this would be in Act 5. Scene 1, line 423. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. So, good night unto you all. Give me your hands, if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends. And I'm well aware that Renaissance English is not necessarily easy. It does get easier with practice. So my suspicion will be by the ending of the semester, even though the plays are more complex, you're going to find them more accessible. That's usually what most students tell me. And it's not because the plays are getting easier. In fact, in some ways, the themes are much more sophisticated. It's that you become more accustomed to the language and the rhythm of the language. I've often likened it to a foreign language that you know perhaps 90% of. So, if we shadows have offended, if we've offended you, and he likens actors to shadows, think but this, and all is mended. So he's telling us, if you've been offended, consider this. And I love the idea of likening an actor to a shadow, because the shadow is a reflection, basically, of reality. That you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. And notice that theme of sleep, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in fact, all of this could be said to be a kind of dream. But we assume, and during the time of the Renaissance, it would have assumed that the fairyland occurred and was real, much like the witch world was real, something we'll talk about when we get to Macbeth. So this could have indeed occurred. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. Though I would say that love itself can be like a dream, something that's insubstantial, perhaps unreal. Gentles, meaning gentlemen and gentlewomen. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. So if you are upset or offended, please forgive us and we will make amends. And as I am an honest Puck. But the problem is Puck is not known for being honest. So again, we have to wonder, how sincere is this apology? Puck is mischievous and Puck is known for lying. And as I am an honest Puck. This is one of the great ways of playing Puck in the play, is in the moment where he makes his, quote, mistake, unquote, about putting the love juice on the wrong man's eyes. It could literally be a mistake. After all, he's told, quite frankly, to put the juice in the man, or in the eyes of the man wearing the Athenian garb. So he could have made a mistake. And rather than put it in Lysander's eyes, he put it in Demetrius's. Or rather than put it in Demetrius's eyes, he put it in Lysander's eyes. but he also could have done it very deliberately because he likes to create chaos. And an actor playing Puck can make it seem more deliberate or less deliberate. So you have a certain amount of latitude with Puck when you're playing Puck as an actor, perhaps than some of the other characters. But it's true that when he says, as I am an honest Puck, we have to raise our eyebrows and think, I don't know. And if we have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue. So that would be hissing, as in booing and hissing. We will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. And again, Puck is a liar. So this backhanded compliment, I wonder how sincere it really is. So good night unto you all. So this is his way of basically telling us that the play's come to an end. Give me your hands if we be friends. So he's asking for applause at this point. And Robin shall restore amends, because he's also known as Robin Goodfellow as well. So those are just a few of the quotes that I wanted to highlight. I thought that for today's attendance question, which would be due on Wednesday, the 1st of March, believe it or not, 8 a.m., but certainly if you need an extension, let me know. For you to identify an important quote in A Midsummer Night's Dream and why you feel it's important. It could be one of the quotes I highlighted, or it could be a different quote. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And certainly if you wanted to reply to one of your classmates, you could, much like you would in a class discussion if we were meeting live. But this should give us a nice overview of some of the important quotes as well from your perspective, not just necessarily my perspective. So that next class, what we can do is talk a little bit about writing papers and the conventions for writing papers, some sample paper topics, and also Much Ado About Nothing, another comedy about the follies associated with love. This comedy set very much in the world of reality. And as we will talk about next class, this comedy, if it had ended tragically, would be a play that you may or may not know of, but you will by the ending of the semester, called Othello. So we'll talk about some of those similarities next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on Wednesday. Do remember to hand in your journal by 11:59 p.m. on A Midsummer Night's Dream, about a page or so of informal response. Take care. Bye-bye.